Welcome to the Sex Talk Cafe, a podcast where you'll get to learn from the experts in the field of sex, love, and relationships. The mission of the Sex Talk Cafe is to normalize the conversation on sexuality while building a bridge between the sexual and spiritual. I'm your host, Susan Morgan Taylor. I'm a holistic sex therapist, intuitive coach, and specialist in women's sexuality and feminine spirituality. I'm the founder and CEO of the Pathway to Pleasure Collective, where I help women and couples around the world restore intimacy, save their relationship, and get back to love without feeling like they have to sacrifice themselves just to keep their partner happy. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the Sex Talk Cafe. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Sex Talk Cafe. My guest today is Shauna Stewart. Shauna is a certified sexuality educator, a certified embodied intimacy and relationship coach, and the founder of Linger Boutique, and the host of Life Turned On podcast. With a background as a nonprofit CEO, a master's in public administration, and experience as a homeschool mom, Shauna brings a unique blend of leadership, compassion, and embodied insight to helping others cultivate pleasure, connection, and self-discovery. Her mission is to normalize rest and pleasure as pathways to feeling more connected and alive. Hello, Shauna. Welcome to the Sex Talk Cafe.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited about today's conversation.
I am too. I'm so glad that you're here, and I know we're going to have a great time. I love our topic today. I think we're going to talk a lot about pleasure and receiving and why that is so important. I think there's so much good, juicy stuff we're going to get into on that our listeners may have never considered or thought about. So I'm excited to jump into that with you. Before we do that, you have an interesting story, and I would love for you to just share with our listeners a little bit about your background and how you came into this work with sexuality and pleasure.
Yeah, well, before I valued any sort of sexuality and pleasure, I considered myself a very high-achieving, thriving individual. I really prioritized my career. I was very focused on doing, giving, and achieving and productivity. I definitely thought that pleasure was something that would only distract me from my big goals that I wanted to achieve. And sexual pleasure, I definitely was raised to believe that it was something that would only cause harm. Until, of course, you're married, and then it's supposed to be wonderful. And then when it's awkward and weird, right. We're left confused and so forth. But yeah, so I was just kind of I was a nonprofit CEO. I absolutely loved my job, but it was also, I was operating at an intensity level that looking back now, I'm just like, how did I do that? Yeah. And eventually during COVID times, I got very sick. On May 23rd, 2020, I went to bed with a thumb cramp and a patch of hives that spread. The patch of hives spread all over my body. The crippling pain spread all over my body. And within 2 weeks, I couldn't move off the couch without help. At about 2:00 in the afternoon, every afternoon, my husband was walking me to the bathroom, handing me water bottles that were 2 inches from my hands. I had hives for 9 months, and then a whole list of symptoms that was like a mile long. I joke that you need an old-timey scroll to list all the symptoms that I just kept chasing for these 9 months. And I went to all the doctors, all the specialists. And while they can see that my tests, like my white blood cell count and liver enzymes and so forth, were like off the charts high, they couldn't actually diagnose me or figure out what was wrong. So I never got a diagnosis. And there were just times that I was super, super desperate for pain relief that I couldn't get anywhere. And one night I was deep in the bowels of Google, I guess. And I realized two things. One is that everything that I was self-diagnosing myself with, because we're all our own best doctors on the Google when we're sick and desperate, the root cause of everything was stress, or that it was not going to make anything better, right? So like, regardless of what kind of condition I could have been diagnosed with, stress would only limit my body's ability to heal or make the symptoms worse. And then the second piece I learned was this idea that pleasure was the antidote to pain. which blew my mind because, like I said, I had very much put pleasure in the box of frivolous, unnecessary, distracting, and harmful.
Yeah.
And so I just had to sit with that for quite a while. And then I was just like, well, I guess nothing else is working. I guess I'll give pleasure a shot. And I started out with very platonic pleasures, like the smile of my kids' faces and really trying to be really present when I was snuggling them and like feeling the energy of the hug and the pleasure of a hug, not just going through the motions of a hug. And there was a little blip where my body started healing or craving ice cream, which was very unusual for me and also highly inflammatory, but somehow made my body feel better. And then eventually I wanted to reconnect with my husband in a more intimate way and kind of move out of this caregiver patient role that we had been playing and trying to figure out what our new relationship would look like. And kind of during that time, I decided that I was no longer available for average married person sex. And I wanted the kind of pleasure that was going to curl my toes and like light all my cells on fire when he walked in the door.
Nice.
So that just began a whole journey for me.
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. And I'm really curious too, because I think there's so many couples out there that can identify. I know I was one of them when I was in my marriage. You know, it was yeah, like there is something more available and I have no idea how to get it. And I'm curious if you'd be comfortable sharing, because I think a lot of our listeners can relate to that piece. And what did you do? Like, how did you bring more of that pleasure back into your relationship with your husband? What did y'all do to get that spark alive? And did you arrive at that place of that toe curling, amazing, ecstatic pleasure in the sexual arena with your partner? If you're willing to share as much as you're willing to share.
Yeah, I think talking about it helps normalize it. And I know that that's a big part of your mission here with the podcast is just normalizing these conversations. So initially we started off very slow. We started off with just like rearranging our bedroom so it felt less like a hospital room or just kind of getting rid of old sheets and linens, and we got a new bed and rearranged where the bed was and just reclaiming our space. Sure. I think that a lot of times our spaces can tend to be cluttered with laundry, exercise equipment, and pictures of our children, which I love my children, and there's no pictures of my children in my bedroom because they don't need to be there. So we just kind of created this little sanctuary for us that felt a lot more sensual. We were mindful of like textures and quality and lighting and all of that. We did try to go to like one of your traditional sex stores to find something that might be kind of fun to play with. And I was really mindful of what my experience was like in the store. And I loved, like, the customer service was excellent, but I felt gross the whole time I was in there. And I think part of that was my own shame. And part of that was just general, like the marketing and the experience where you're in fluorescent lights, you're kind of like in this weird strip mall that you're hoping nobody sees you in. The lingerie, like, it wasn't made ethically because it's, $12 and very thin. And I'm just like, I am a grown-ass woman. I'm well-educated. I have kids. Like, nothing that I was seeing was anything that I was identifying with. And then, the packaging on a lot of the products I was just recognizing like this sense of like feeling objectified, like the stuff isn't actually for me. While the toys might be used on me or the lingerie might be worn on me, none of it was actually for me. And so that kind of planted a whole seed. And I was really kind of thinking about that experience. Fast forward, my husband and I are driving out to a wine tasting trip for his birthday. I noticed 3 of those stores and I just started really thinking about that experience. And I finally turned to him and I was just like, what if we turn that whole model on its head. And instead of centering men's pleasure, we created one little space in this world that actually centers women's pleasure, sells all the same things, but differently. And so he does all my government forms and my tech, so he's a big help. But we dreamed it up, and it was actually kind of like putting the business out front forced us to have conversations, to learn things. Like I joke that I opened Linger, which is a lingerie and sexual wellness boutique, before I knew anything about retail or sex. And people would often say, like, of course you know things about sex because you have 2 kids. I'm like, sure, I know about reproduction, but I didn't actually know anything about pleasure. Yeah. And so it really like caused us to have to learn. So it was listening to podcasts, it was reading books, going or accessing workshops online or in person, putting ourselves in situations that we might not otherwise have done before, which are really challenging, and having conversations. Like I think like we have a rhythm of Sunday soaks. So every Sunday we get naked, get in the bathtub after the kids go to sleep. And the rules are no sex, no screens. So it's just physical intimacy time where we can talk, but there's never this like pressure or like, will we, won't we kind of thing. And so lots of just deep conversations and, learnings and saying hard things and digesting podcasts or workshops that we've taken together.
Well, it's really beautiful. And I like this starting point of the boudoir, like what I'd call like the boudoir. Mm-hmm. You know, that's what I call my bedroom. It's my boudoir. And in this aspect of creating space, which is really kind of a very fundamental thing that we tend to, I think, overlook a lot of times. Like, I think a lot of times we're just trying to get down to the deed. And we forget that an aspect of eroticism and enjoyment, aka pleasure, has a lot to do with the environment that we're in and creating beauty, like actually bringing a touch of beauty to that. And it sounds like, you know, you started there. And then I also like how you, with Linger Boutique, we need to talk about this because this is your boutique. I'm sure that sort of sprouted out from your realization that we need something out there for women. And there's an aspect of that, like an aspect of classiness and beauty that really caters to a different aspect of our erotic wiring. So I think that's really awesome. And so Linger Boutique, now this is a brick and mortar shop and an online store, is that right?
Correct. We're available online, and then our online store is located in Olympia, Washington.
I love it. You have some beautiful items. So listeners, you need to definitely head over to Linger. What's the URL on that real quick, just for everybody while we're talking about it?
Lingerboutique.com.
Lingerboutique.com. Yeah, you have some lovely items. I haven't been to that in-person store, but next time I'm on that coast, I'll be sure to stop by. And just some lovely, beautiful items. And I like, too, how you really took this educational approach. I believe you've hosted events and such at your boutique on different topics and really doing some outreach and education. Can you say a little bit more about that and why you feel like that's an important aspect of what you do with the boutique?
Yeah, I think it's an important aspect of what we do because we have so much shame and stigma around a lot of pleasure. I mean, just even the word pleasure, I thought it was kind of a soft word, but it can be very jarring for people.
Triggering.
And even as hard as I've worked to create this beautiful, comfortable, approachable space, I still know that it can be a challenge for people. But I think even if people don't come to our workshops or education, even just the marketing of it, and they're like, oh, somebody else has that, is dealing with that too. Somebody else is dealing with menopause and loss of libido. Somebody else is dealing with maybe not understanding what turns them on and their like erotic blueprint, which I know you know about. And we've done like fun, like bougie, we did a bougie brunch and smutty book exchange. And just like the opportunity to come together in community and have a shared experience and look around a room and see like, oh, I'm not alone, and have these aha moments in community, I think is really powerful. And again, even if you're not showing up to them for whatever reason, whether it's timing or nervousness, you know that other people are. So it's like setting an example and modeling that you can choose pleasure. You can do something that feels maybe edgy or a little outside of your comfort zone in a safe, comfortable, held place. We never take photos of anybody during these workshops. We tend to set like a really specific container for what's allowed and not in those spaces, just to make sure everyone feels really safe and comfortable.
I love that, which is really key to pleasure, right? We have to be in that relaxed state so our nervous system can feel safe enough to even have pleasure. But let's talk about what is pleasure. I really agree with you on this, that word is very activating, and it sounds like you weren't really totally aware of that fact when you started out on this path, as neither was I. My business is Pathway to Pleasure. I didn't realize that, getting, there's so much censorship and getting filtered out and shadow banned just with that word, which is really sad. But I think because we have this tendency to associate the word pleasure merely with sexual pleasure, but it's so much more than that. I'm really curious on what's your relationship with that word, and how would you define it, and how does that show up in the work that you do?
Yeah, to me, I define pleasure as really feeling good, connected, and alive. And I think that what's unfortunate about the English language that I've really been learning over the last few years is how limited our language is. Like, we just have one word to describe a lot of different things. And so, like, I just finished reading a book that was like, don't prioritize pleasure. Like, pleasure's just all the same things I said. Like, it's distracting, or it's frivolous, or it's going to lead you to fail in life. And sure, and that's why I say it's like, it feels good, connected, and alive, And I think that if we have all of those elements present, we can't really go wrong with it. And if we can learn to trust our bodies and our intuition, which we've been very separated from in our culture, we can trust that we can lean into pleasure, and that it'll guide us, our pleasures, what feels good, what makes us feel connected, what makes us feel alive, will lead us to good choices for us, healthy choices. Yeah.
And I think we'd have a much healthier society. And I love that definition. Good, healthy, and alive. Those were the 3 words, right?
Yeah, connected and alive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, healthy is an outcome of that.
100%.
We feel connected, we feel alive, which is really beautiful. And some of, I think, why there's so much shame around, there's a lot around this piece, right? There's a lot of shame that we carry around allowing ourselves to feel those things, like good, healthy, and alive. There's sort of this conditioning, and I think it really stems back to the puritanical roots of our country, where it was, the whole work ethic of work hard, and masturbation is bad, and, you don't want the devil to get you, and if you sink too far into those earthly pleasures, you're going to be doomed. So there's a lot of that, I think, inherently built into our culture and our society. But what would you say is the biggest obstacle that you see people encounter when they're wanting to have more joy in their life, and maybe get out of some of these patterns of shame and overwork that just leads to more stress and disconnection, rather than more of what most of us really desire, which is that connection and joy and feeling good?
Yeah, what I see is a lot of unworthiness and a sense of lack of deservingness. Yes. So even just I kind of see my business, they're interconnected, but I have the lingerie side, and then I have the sexual wellness side, and the lingerie in my boutique is what you see first when you walk in. And the messages that people have internalized just can break my heart sometimes, where they're just like, oh, I'm not young enough, when maybe at one point in my life I could have worn that. I'm like, your body can, there's no actual physical barrier to you wearing and looking beautiful in this lingerie. It's in your head, what culture has taught you and what we've internalized about who gets to wear lingerie, or gets to, and not even about the lingerie, but it's who gets to feel beautiful. and have beautiful things, back to that essence of like beauty and eroticism. So I'm too old, I'm too big, my body's not right, or I don't have a partner. So sometimes we don't think that we deserve or are worthy of pleasure, especially of the sexual kind, if we don't have a partner.
Right.
And so I think that it's just like choosing self, like saying I deserve it, saying I pleasure is my birthright, and owning and claiming that is a great first step in that direction. But the lack of deservingness, and then the just shame and general shame and stigma. Like, I mean, even the way I was talking earlier about my initial experience in a sex, I'm like, oh, I'm not like those girls, or I'm not like, I don't look like that, or I don't have big enough breasts, or I don't have, like we just have all the stuff. And unpacking that layer by layer by layer, like as we shed those layers of shame, stigma, unworthiness, like what's underneath can be so beautiful and life-giving and fulfilling.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I know I've really discovered around that piece of the unworthiness is that how we actually resolve that particular a wound or thought pattern or pattern of feeling or whatever you want to call it, how we actually transform that is through the act of allowing ourselves to receive. Like that's actually how we heal that. Have you found that to be true as well? Expanding our capacity to receive expands, lessens that feeling of I don't deserve it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
I want to talk more about that because I know you have a retreat that you're hosting that's really centered around that for women. But one other thing I want to say before we kind of dive into that is I find it's really common with women in particular, because when I started out on my sex therapy path, I was really wanting to just work with women, individual women, because of my journey, my awakening happened while I was not in a relationship, and I thought, wow, like if more women could access this, the world would be a different place, and we'd probably end up in happier, healthier relationships. But I find that happens a lot. You hear that a lot for a lot of women. Pleasure and even in sex and sexuality are just not relevant to them unless they're in a relationship. So it's like, oh, I'll come see you when I'm in a relationship. And I'd love to get your take on that, because I think that needs to be, we need a reframe on that. We need, whether you're in a relationship or not, we need to learn how to be sexual beings and work on our sexuality regardless of whether we're in a relationship or not. I'm curious if you've seen them. So you're not in your head right now, so I'm assuming that you've run into that a lot as well in your work, because you work a lot with women. What's your antidote for that? What do you how do you help women sort of reframe that? It's sort of like a misaligned thought, I believe personally.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've been working on is trying to connect like sexuality and sexual energy to our life force and creative energy. It's all the same, like our life force energy, creative energy, and sexual energy is all the same. And so if we can tap into our own sexuality, we just become truer, more vibrant versions of ourselves in the world in so many ways. And I think one of the big disservices and stigmas of our culture is that the women's role in sex is to give. And so a lot of like, if you're in a couple, or maybe if you're single because this isn't what you want to do, it's just like you're kind of over the scripts, over what's been handed to us as like what sex is, quote unquote, and being able to expand our idea of what sex can be and how it can be experienced, connecting sex to like connection to others, sure, but it's a way we can connect to ourselves, and it's a way that we can connect to whatever our higher power is, the universe, the divine, anything like that, but being able to feel more connected to the world in general. And I think self pleasure is a big part of that, and self pleasure can be experienced in very platonic ways, and in very like erotic, sensual, sexual ways. And I think that too, like I am married. I've been married for 13 years. My partner and I have done a lot of things together to strengthen our relationship and to be able to experience pleasure like we've never experienced before together. But we've both have practices that are solo. And we have a lot of respect for and help each other carve out time for these different practices. That's more than just like driving to an orgasm.
Right.
But really about engaging the whole body as a erotic being, finding out what kind of touch feels good, and really like giving yourself everything that you want. Yeah. and finding out what that is and learning how to take that in. I think like there's a lot of practices from just like self-touch, breath work, setting a sensual space, engaging all of the senses that when you come out of an experience like that, you're like, whoa, my body's, that's possible for me. My body can create and experience all of this pleasure without anybody outside forces.
It's free. I mean, I find that really freeing. Yeah, and I think solo play is so important. And we tend to discount it when we're in relationship, right? We tend to think, well, I'm with someone now, and so therefore all of my enjoyment has to happen in dual play with my partner, and the solo play kind of goes out the window. And I agree that I think that that's a really important piece to keep aspects of that alive, because the more that we can cultivate that, we're empowered in that way, and there's sort of less pressure on the other person to have to produce this thing for the other, and that's great, and we can do that. It's awesome to learn how to do that. But I know in my journey, like, I did not know how to even do that until I'd figured it out within my own body and found those pathways within, and then it was like, wow, like relationship is just icing on the cake, you know. That's just like another aspect of pleasure and enjoyment. So I love that. And I think that's such an important piece, is that solo play. The other thing you said that I think is really important is, and so true, is that a lot of women have this condition, I think it's conditioning, that they have to give in sex, which is so interesting. I think that's just sort of remnants of our, you know, sort of our skewed, toxic patriarchal or toxic masculinity that we have, sort of, you know. I don't like to like diss on the patriarchy because everything has distortions. There's a beautiful things about patriarchy. It's just that it's been out of balance, and hopefully that's going to change at some point. It is changing, but it's sort of that remnant that sex is for men. You know, and we see that a lot in all the media. And I remember even like as a kid when I was in high school, the rumors going around were, oh, men have better orgasms than women. Like that was just taken as a fact. Like, oh, guys have better orgasms than girls do, you know? And I just like believed that until one day I'm like, wait, how would any guy know? Number one, is he not a woman? So yeah, like these crazy myths that are just sort of spread out there. And think about this though, this idea that we're supposed to give, but our bodies are designed to receive. Like literally we have vaginas, y'all. We are designed to like take the world in, you know, and we're designed to receive. And I think that if women can find the enjoyment in that, and according to our true design, that changes everything for the better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there's just messages that are so subtle and so overt that we just internalize. And I mean, there was a point where I was just like, I would be happy never having sex again. Like, it just doesn't like...
I was there too. I totally get it.
And it wasn't like there was like absence of orgasm. There wasn't like absence of even like emotional connection or anything like that. But I was just like... and it wasn't even my partner. Like, it wasn't even his fault or anything. It was just like all this stuff that I had internalized outside of him. So he's feeling frustrated because he's like, I don't believe any of this. I've never said this. I've never treated you like this. But I have been internalizing like what pastors had said on stage about what a wife's duty is and what my responsibility is. And it's all very fear driven. So it's like, if you don't give this to your husband, he's going to leave or cheat or so. I think a lot of women, if they're in that giving role, they're also not always, but sometimes experiencing a sense of obligation, duty, which are like big time pleasure zappers. Giving for pleasure, like, is so fun. right? You can give, if you find pleasure in giving, that can be so fun, but we have to know what it feels like to receive, to actually purely give in a really meaningful way, I believe. So
I could not agree more. I mean, we don't realize this, that we have to learn actually how to receive first. The receiving is sort of the first step. And I don't know if I think you're familiar with Betty Martin and her work with the Wheel of Consent, which I've done a bunch of training and studying with her. And the first thing we learn to do is how to open our receiving channels. That's the gateway into the capacity to discern, what we want and don't want, which prevents us from going into ideally, when we get good at that, it prevents us from going into those places where we're giving out obligation. Because if we're not in touch with our own domain of what do I want, what do I don't want, what do I like, not, this or that, we don't have that capacity to know. And so there's a lot of defaulting into obligatory sex and obligation and tolerating things that maybe don't feel so good, which doesn't take us to more, what was your word earlier? Connection, feeling alive, feeling good, connected, and alive.
Yeah, for sure. And I found, like, in my own journey, the more I'm able to fill my own, like, energy, pleasure stores, if you will, fill them individually, allow my partner to fill them, like, then giving is a great thing, right? Like it can be so joyful and so fun, but it's like not what we're doing, it's how we're doing it. Yes. And I think about that in so many aspects of life in general, but especially sexuality. Like, a specific act can look the same on the outside and be experienced radically different on the inside, depending on where we're coming to that experience from. And so, a lot of communication. My husband and I have gotten really good about just talking through expectations, borrowing a lot of what we've learned from the kink communities and so forth. Even if it's like going to be a missionary night, we still, borrow a lot of the skill set of communicating boundaries and what we want to experience, how we want to feel together before an interaction. And so then it switches off that stress and anxiety button in our head, because then we can feel safe and we know where we're going.
Yeah, and I think a lot of couples discount the need for that and the importance of that, and how much more pleasure can live inside the play space when you have that clarity. There tends to be this myth out there of like, if we have to talk about it like that, then it's not romantic, it's not sexy. And how sexy is it to, like, not have any idea if your partner's enjoying it, or to be the one that's sitting there like faking it? Like, that's not sexy, like,
right?
Either. So yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that level of clarity and having the skill set to be able to have those kinds of conversations, Shauna, like what you just said that you and your husband do, that's a whole skill set. And it can be just like night and day. And when you have that, there's like the depths and heights of pleasure that are available just are exponential at that point. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. I think for myself, I've experienced it. Maybe you have. I know so many people that I've worked with in coaching calls have experienced this, of like the stories that we're telling ourselves in our head is something. It's like, what if they don't like it? Am I doing this wrong? What if I do this? Are they going to freak out? And instead of just like having those conversations ahead of time, but we're never modeled that, right? Television never shows us conversation about what would you like to do tonight. And I think anticipation is very hot, right? So if you're talking about it ahead of time, then you have something to look forward to rather than worrying about, because we're just kind of like both anticipation and anxiety are like future thinking, but one we're worried, one we're looking forward to it. And the looking forward to it is just as much part of the pleasure process as the experience itself.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you said that. Yeah, that's where the dopamine comes in, right? Expectation actually helps our dopamine let it down. So versus being in an anxiety state, which is more cortisol, which works against our capacity for arousal and pleasure. Well, let's dive in here too. So I know you love to work with women and women's sexuality, and you have a really amazing retreat that you're hosting in Tuscany, I hear. I want to hear about this, where it's really centered around this whole idea of receiving and relaxing, and that as being a really important part of enjoyment and pleasure and feeling connected and alive. So talk to me about this retreat experience. It sounds amazing.
Thank you. I'm so excited about it. So the retreat is called Receive, and it's a luxury experience for women who desire more rest and pleasure in their lives. And the goal is really to take you out of constant go mode, constant giving mode, and take you out of all of your responsibilities, plonk you in the hills of hills of Tuscany, and we're going to take care of all your needs for you. We're going to provide you beautiful, very grounded luxury accommodations surrounded by farmland and nature. So it's going to be very peaceful and quiet. Take care of your meals so you don't have to cook or do dishes with chef prepared meals. And then we're going to do several days of pleasure workshops, embodiment exercises in the morning. And the goal there is to really help you immerse yourself into your body, immerse yourself into Italian pleasure culture even, because the Italians don't feel shame and stigma around pleasure. So what can we learn from them? Yeah. And then we will talk about exploring what pleasure means to each of us as individuals, because all of us are going to experience pleasure, desire different things differently. Each body is unique, each person's desires. So we're going to explore. We're going to spend a day just identifying and releasing a lot of the shame, stigma, and barriers that we experience in rest and pleasure, and then learn how to receive. There's going to be a lot of dialogue, a lot of reflection, and then a lot of embodiment practices, because I think that a lot of times we're just so in our head. And while the brain is absolutely our largest sexual organ, our body is really where we're experiencing a lot of the pleasure, and we've been so disconnected. The mind and the body are very disconnected in our culture. So we're going to learn how to bring those together and learn the wisdom of our body and what our body has to say about rest and pleasure. In the afternoons, you'll get the luxury of unscheduled time. So folks can read a book by the pool, go for a walk, for a bike ride in the farmlands, go visit a nearby village. I have one gal who just plans on napping, which I love for her. And we're just going to really focus on stepping out of the giving role and into receiving role, so we can really know what that experience feels like, so we can learn how to cultivate more of that when we get back home.
Yeah, I love this. I think it's so important that we have these kind of spaces to retreat into, where we can really just sort of have the outside world is taken care of, and we get to really just drop into more of this relaxed feminine aspect of receiving and cultivating that. Because what I've learned is we're out of balance. I think and especially, I know you're a mom of young kids and you homeschool and you run a business. I mean, there's a lot that we have to do that draws from the get it done, get shit done mode, which is very different than I'm going to bake a pie mode and work in the garden and smell the flowers and feel the sun on my skin and be in, sexy goddess mode. It's a different part of our nervous system entirely. And I think that we need to be intentional around cultivating, especially in today's world, if we have kids and we're running businesses or working jobs. As women, we really have to be intentional around cultivating the other polarity, the receptive polarity. And I think that it's not necessarily an easy task, but it's a worthy pursuit, and one that as women, I think we need to learn how to do, so that we can have more juiciness and aliveness. If we're just in go mode all the time, we dry out, we burn out, it gets brittle and we crack, and we end up perhaps getting sick like you did, Shauna. It definitely does not lead to feeling more connected and alive if we're in that chronic stress state for too long.
Yeah. And unfortunately, my story with sickness is not unique. I just think it's the most basic, it's almost become, and I say this with so much love and understanding too, and empathy, it's become a cliche. We just expect women to burn out, and we have all of these workshops and courses and books about how to not burn out, as if not burning out is the goal. And we're missing kind of like the bigger picture of what is available to us in terms of experiences.
Yeah, I agree. And I got distracted there for 1 second because something on my screen. I apologize for that.
No
I'll edit
worries.
this part out maybe, or maybe not. Yeah, you're right. There's just this expectation that we're going to burn out. And what if the opposite was true? What if we were able
What
to
if the
have,
opposite was true?
yeah, more balance? And so that, I think, is really a big part of what you're doing with what you've brought into the world with your boutique and the retreats and the work you're doing with intimacy coaching is, ways for us to find more balance. And I think as we do that individually, that becomes a movement. Collectively, we can create more balance in the world so that we're not so stuck in this idea of productivity at all costs and growth at all costs. I think that's such a paradigm as well, particularly of the Western world, where it's all about more and grow bigger, bigger, bigger. Like, there's a lot to be said for letting it be as is and just having enjoyment and being in the flow. I think there's certainly times for growth and expansion, but when do we stop for enjoyment? Enjoyment is such an important piece where we just enjoy the fruits of our labors and enjoy what we've created in our lives without needing anything to be different or more, or bigger or better.
Yes, thank you so much for saying that. I love that so much. And I think, we have a lot of messaging coming at us that we need to keep going all the time. That productivity, we might value productivity and practicality kind of above beauty and pleasure. And yeah, I think too with like the rest and pleasure, like the rest element, we can't experience pleasure without rest. The rest comes first, and that's really where we're going to feel the restoration. But the pleasure is where we're going to come alive. And it's just not enough anymore. I don't think like the work-life balance nonsense,
right.
I think is just a completely unhelpful
Yeah, fuck that.
dialogue that we hold as canon, like, oh, we should be pursuing work-life balance. I'm like, no, I want to live.
Yeah.
I want to feel alive. And yes, I know that I probably need to work to be able to sustain life, but those two shouldn't be equal. And
Or it's such a compartmentalization. Work is this or
Right.
work. No, I'm having pleasure over here. Instead of how do we weave
Yeah.
those two together in a way where,
Yes.
I like to bring more enjoyment. When I get into that mindset of like, gotta get shit done, I am like, I am fucking not happy. Like I'm stressed
Yeah.
out. On one pointed laser focus, I am totally disconnected because I'm certainly not paying attention to much less my surroundings or even the fact that I have a body at that point. It's all neck up. And it's like, that is not really, it's not a fun place to really be or to stay for an extended period of time. And so something I've been playing with is like, okay, can I get into that expansive state where I feel good and I can bring that into the task I'm doing. So I'm not like tightening up around it and trying to, it just doesn't feel good. And I know that I always produce better work, get better response, better results when I'm bringing joy and love. It's the energy behind, like you said, it's not what you're doing, but how you do it. So it's very much that piece of the energy behind what we bring in that really creates the beauty in the world and the happiness that we all want.
Yeah. And I love that you're saying that with work and like how much better is your work? How much better are you able to serve your clients or get the jobs done when it's coming from a place of awakened creativity, when like your body and your mind are all firing on all the right cylinders because they're alive, they feel good, and you're in a parasympathetic state. So just the abilities of your mind open up, the abilities in your body open up differently, your ability to connect opens up differently when we're operating from a pleasure. So it's just like the pleasure just infuses every other aspect of life versus like having to clench up and just bear through it.
It can be a superpower, not a liability. So we need to get out of this mindset that pleasure is a liability, and it can be our superpower when we have a better relationship with it. So I would love to give you an opportunity if there's anything else that you want to add to our conversation today. Now would be a great time to do that. And if you'd like to share with our listeners how they can connect with you and find out more about you and your work and the awesome stuff that you are doing in the world.
Yeah, I think that the only thing I would love to say in conclusion, if you will, is to encourage listeners, if pleasure feels really edgy or if it feels too much, is just starting really slow. Like, it's a journey. Start really slow, and just even things that you're already doing, if you already feel like your time is too compact, your life is too rigid, that you don't have room to carve out for rest and pleasure yet, is how can you make the things that you're doing already just a little bit more pleasurable? Like, can you find more pleasure in where you're sitting now? Can you make yourself a cup of tea and sink into the car differently? Or just building in a mindfulness around pleasure of what you're already doing. And then I think you'll end up finding more space for rest and pleasure in other aspects of life. In terms of connecting with me, my website is lingerboutique.com. I'm on Instagram at linger.u. And like I said, we have a lingerie and sexual wellness boutique that does feel like a little more classy, elevated, and our goal is really to help you feel like you. And I'm offering coaching services and the retreat in May in Italy if you want to join.
Awesome. And all of that is available. Info on that is on your website at thelingerboutique.com.
Correct.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that will all be in the show notes. So, well, awesome. Shauna, thank you so much for being my guest.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Susan.
Thank you for joining me today for the Sex Talk Cafe. Please be sure to show your support by subscribing to this podcast and sharing it with your friends. To keep in the loop on future events and happenings, and to grab your copy of our free ebook, The Pleasure Keys, 7 Secrets to Feminine Sexual Fulfillment, visit us online at pathwaytopleasure.com.